Okay, in this lecture I will have two objects, really, a loaf of bread and a jug of beer. Now, we've spent quite a bit of time talking about agriculture in the Old Kingdom and how it was all based on essentially growing plants, mostly grain, and how this was used to feed all the people working in the pyramids. So I thought what it might be interesting is to take a look at the process of making bread and making beer. Now, I will say here that I'm not going to say too much about the beer making because I've made a podcast about that, and I popped that into our course folder this week. So anyway, let's take a look at this. So first, let's look at some archaeology that shows what bread looked like. So this is a stele, and a stele is almost like a tombstone shaped. You can think of it like that. And then it has all these images and text written on it. This is from a man named Itger, and he dates to the 4th dynasty from Giza, which is where the Great Pyramid is. Now, you can see him sitting here, and these are actually the loaves of bread that are standing up. What we'll see is that bread was sometimes made of long loaves, like what we have. Sometimes they were made like little cones, and so they were a little bit different shaped than sometimes what we see today, although these look like normal bread today. Here are the cone-shaped breads. This is from the 5th dynasty, so the dynasty after Ittir. And here you can see they're shaped like little cones. And so I don't know if I have any images of these, but these were all baked in pans, or sometimes stone or clay pots. And so these were baked in a conical shaped form, and then the others were baked in a long loaf, almost like what we do today. Here's an interesting picture from a tomb, and what it's showing is the process of making bread. Now, it's not showing the threshing, so it's not showing the gathering of the grain, the beating of the grain, taking the grains off, grinding it up. But what this person's doing here is mixing the dough in this pot. This person is now shaping the dough. And what this person is doing, and you can see it here represented, they were just baked in flames. So they made ashes and then put the bread in there. So that's how it was done, probably in a lot of the homes where it was baked. But there were a few different ways about how bread was made and how it was baked. So I just showed you the image where the people were putting loaves of bread directly into the fire. I mentioned molds a little bit earlier, so you would put the dough in a formed mold, and then you'd put the mold itself into the fire. Or we've got lots of archaeological remains of ovens. So they would start a fire in an oven, and then they would pop the bread into the oven. Now, of course, before I talk about the slide, you have to think about this done on a mass scale, because we're talking about feeding thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are building the pyramids. So that just shows you sort of a smaller scale. And I said at the beginning, I'm not going to talk too much about beer, but I do want to point out that some relatively new archaeology has been discovered. And it comes from the early dynastic period at Abydos, where this is almost like a beer factory. They were making 6,000 gallons of beer at a time. And I know you can't quite see it from this sort of far away view, but there are 8 large areas where they ended up making beer. So this is pretty amazing. And this makes sense that something like this has been discovered because, as we talked about, people ate bread and they drank beer as the primary beverage. And this is adults and children. There's a nice little archaeological piece showing a little kid saying, "Give me some because I'm thirsty." And anyway, I've given you the link here. I'll give the live link in our Blackboard course where you can read about this brewery that was just recently discovered. And then this is a close-up of some of the pots on how this was actually made. And yeah, I think in the next slide, yes. So how it was made, techniques for making beer. So sometimes there's a couple different ways, and it's not totally clear how it's done. But we do have some nice models that were made in the first intermediate period and into the middle kingdom. And when we get to that first intermediate period, I'll show you a few of these. But it looked like at least one way you could make beer is to make the bread, crumble it up, and then pour water over it. and then put it into the jars and let that ferment. Another way that there's a couple different archaeological pieces that show this is that they took loaves of fresh dough and then put them on a cloth over a pot or a vase or something that you're going to bottle the beer, and then you would pour water over the dough, and so the water would pour off the dough, pour into the jugs, and then that would end up fermenting a little, and that's what people would drink as their beer. So it's not quite like the whole process how we make beer today, but it's very similar. And there's been lots of studies done on ancient beer from Egypt showing how nutritious it was. A good guess is that if you held up like in a glass, a see-through glass jar, that beer would look very different because it was probably full of bits and pieces of the grain, the bread, and so on. So it might have been a little more chewy than what our beer is like today, which is mostly clear. So what can beer and bread tell us about sustainability? And these are things that you already know about because we've been talking about them for quite a while. You need massive amounts of grain to be grown. So again, they're totally dependent on the Nile floods, all these farmers growing, all these religious estates collecting the taxes. That needs to be grown, it needs to be treated, meaning it needs to be threshed, the grains taken off the stems, collected and measured. We talked about that before, how they actually measured every single thing. And then you have to move the grain to where it needs to be distributed, and then distributed by the state. And then, of course, you have to think about what the effort it takes to make the bread and the beer. And then one thing I really want you to think about, because we will be looking at this next week, is what happens when the Nile flood gets reduced for whatever reason. What happens then to this entire process? So stay tuned for what those answers will be.